But thank you again for being here with us. For those of you who don't know, and you probably do, the Brennan Center is a public policy advocacy think tank organization, and we also litigate cases in the areas of democracy and justice. And producing reports like the one you're here to listen about today is at the hallmark of what we do at the Brennan Center. We pride ourselves on producing high-quality intellectual work that is in the news and that keeps people talking and thinking. I am going to just very briefly introduce our moderator because I want us to get to why we're here today, which is a very vibrant and robust conversation on this report and its related issues. Scott Shane, whom is a writer for the New York Times, is going to be moderating our discussion today. He is a reporter who covers intelligence and national security in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. He was also a reporter for the Baltimore Sun from 1983 to 2004, where he covered a range of issues from courts to medicine, and he also wrote a major series on brain surgery, schizophrenia, and covered issues dealing with guns and crime. He was also the Sun's Moscow correspondent from 1988 to 1991, and he wrote a book on the collapse of the Soviet Union, Dismantling Utopia, How Information Ended the Soviet Union. So without further ado, I will turn this program over to Scott.
Thank you very much. I will just say a couple things and then introduce the panel, and each of them will speak for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll try to throw it open to questions and comments as soon as possible, because that's often the most interesting part of these affairs. The 2 points I'll make, one has to do with working in Russia, in Moscow, for the last few years of Soviet power, and watching the collapse. And this is actually sort of a theme in my book. If you want to see how secrecy makes a government dysfunctional, you can go back and study the Soviet model. I think that has greatly influenced living there and seeing it operate. Greatly influenced my views on government secrecy. And just to tell one quick story, when I was there, everybody had all the foreigners had a beautiful kind of book map of Moscow with all the streets marked, and it was extremely handy. You could find anything with it. And the publisher of that map was strangely missing because it was actually a CIA map. That all the diplomats and foreigners had, all the foreign correspondents had, whereas actual Soviet citizens had to make do with maps that were simplified and deliberately distorted, because the government knew that if you put out accurate maps, it would help your enemies. For example, if you went to war. And that was just one of many, many examples of how extreme secrecy taken to extreme limits, can just cripple a society and a government. And I guess my second experience with government secrecy is right here in Washington, D.C. You know, when you write about national security, you're always running up against classification and you know, fighting with the government and over what you're allowed to, what you can find out. And then sometimes when you say, well, we're going to write about it, the government comes and says, please don't write about that. That will, you know, screw things up in various ways. And so you then have another tussle. My view is that tussle that goes on all the time between the press and the government is actually a very good thing, and it's sort of the way our society works. But sometimes the government gains the upper hand, and in this case, you might call that overclassification. You know, every government official for many years has recognized, and if you ask them, you know, is overclassification a problem? They'll say, absolutely it is. This report that we're talking about today is not only documents that problem, but also offers some solutions, which is quite unusual. You know, in my business, we're usually just pointing out the problems, and we don't have the duty of trying to point out solutions. But I think it's very well done. It raises a lot of somewhat provocative suggestions for getting over this problem of overclassification, and hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion about it. Now I'm going to just introduce the 4 panelists very quickly, and then they will take it away. I'll go in order that they're going to speak. First is Bill Leonard. He's currently with the National Endowment for Democracy, but he said he's here in his personal capacity. What he's really drawing on is 34 years in the federal government, and in his last job was, and most relevant job was, as director of the Information Security Oversight Office, ISOO, for those who know about it, which is the office that's technically part of the National Archives that oversees classification and declassification policy for the whole government. So he was sort of in the belly of the beast, and you know, interestingly, was not captured, as so many people in government are, by the whole sort of secrecy regime. Second speaker will be Dr. Jennifer Sims. She had a long career in the intelligence community and still consults in that area. She's now director of intelligence studies at Georgetown. And her particular relevance to today's discussion is that she is a member of the Public Interest Declassification Board, which oversees, and, you know, is trying to come up with better policies and better advice for the government on declassification, because you always find that classification outruns declassification. You end up with heaps of secrets, sometimes dating back many years, that are not available not only for the press but to historians. Next would be Elizabeth Goitein of the Brennan Center, who is the principal author, co-author of today's study. She co-directs the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program, and she has been a Senate aide and worked on many of these issues, including government secrecy, while she was with Congress. And last, but by no means least, is Chris Shays, a Republican congressman from Connecticut from 1987 to 2009, where he often seemed to be holding hearings that were of great interest to us in the press. And he has a long-time interest in this question of classification and declassification and what should be secret. And most recently, he has been co-chair of the Federal Commission on Wartime Contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan, which just wrapped up its work. And he was just telling me that it was, having to be interested in everything as a congressman, it was a pleasure to sink his teeth into one topic in great detail. So with no further ado, let me turn to Bill Leonard to start us off.
Thank you, Scott, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My thanks to the Brennan Center for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. There's two quick points I'd like to make. First is I thought it very appropriate in a panel discussing overclassification to sit up here and to disclose to you some very highly classified information. And basically what I'd like to inform you of is that the CIA conducts secret drone attacks around the globe. And if you were to Google that phrase, you would get about 3.5 million hits, to include most recently the article written by Scott this morning in the New York Times. This is one of the, I think, is not only an example of the abuse of the classification system, but I think it highlights how deleterious this is for our national interest. Because basically what this means is that whereas the targets of those drone attacks absolutely positively know that they occur, that their neighbors absolutely know that it occurs, that the innocent family members who lose loved ones know it occurs, that the governments where these occur absolutely know that it occurs. What is the only consequence is that our senior public officials refuse to discuss this or to debate this in public, in the public forum, and to engage the American people in a discussion. And there is nothing that is more profound that a nation can do, than a government can do, than to unleash the violence of war, the brutality of war, in the name of its citizens. And the fact that any government would hide behind classification and avoid a public discussion, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, whether you think it's fruitful or unfruitful, is immaterial. the fact that we would unleash such brutality and refuse to have a public debate over the merits of that, the implications of that, the consequences of that, I think is unconscionable. And if you go back for the last 10 years in terms of the flawed policy decisions that have been made, I think it can be pointed out safely that many of these flawed policy decisions occurred in large part because they were done in secret. I'll just give one example. Several years ago, this nation came to the point of the greatest constitutional crisis since Watergate, with respect to take your pick, whether it was over the NSA warrantless wiretapping program or the terrorist surveillance program. Depending upon your perspective, again, it's immaterial. But that was a program that was over-compartmentalized and shrouded in so much secrecy that only a single lawyer in the entire Department of Justice was able to have access to the particulars of that program. Not even the general counsel of the NSA or the IG of the NSA had access to the legal underpinnings of that program as it was originally crafted, although they obviously knew the operational aspects of it, the information that would be of most interest to any adversaries or enemies. And as a result of this overshrouding of secrecy, we resulted in an illegal program. And that's not my opinion, that's the opinion of the Attorney General of the United States at the time, John Ashcroft, that the program was crafted in such a way that it violated the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Not only that, but this nation came within hours of having the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, the Director of the FBI, and a host of other senior officials resign in protest over this illegal activity, with the President not having a clue that this was happening. All because of classification. It's an example of how classification always guarantees a suboptimal outcome, because by the very act of classification, you avoid the give and take, the consideration of alternatives and things along those lines. So classification should be used with restraint. It should be used where appropriate, but especially where the stakes are most high. And there cannot be an instance any greater than the unleashing of the brutality of war in the name of people. That's when transparency should be most apparent. That's when the shrouding of secrecy should be least. But yet, as we just saw in the news last week, we had the use of drone attacks to kill al-Awlaki, and we're confronted with the reality that a year or so ago, our government, in a court of law, claimed that by virtue of the state secrets privilege, that this couldn't even be talked about in an open court of law in terms of the process used for selecting targets and things along those lines. But yet, after the fact, we have the same government officials leaking supposedly classified information, the same information that our national security couldn't withstand to have disclosed in a court of law. That is a profound abuse of classification and goes to a long way to undermine its effectiveness. And quickly, the second point I want to make is I had the opportunity to, as many of you know, to serve as an expert defense consultant and potential witness in the Thomas Drake case. That's a situation where Thomas Drake was accused of having unauthorized possession of classified documents in his basement in his home. I had the opportunity to review that evidence. I had the opportunity to review a specific email that the government declared was classified, that they found in his basement. Subsequently, the government themselves declassified that email, recognizing from my perspective that they wouldn't be able in a court of law to convince 12 ordinary Americans that somehow, some way, the information in this email, if it was disclosed, would cause damage to national security. But yet they said, they continued to take the position that it was properly classified at the time it was found in his basement, and it was properly classified at the time he was indicted. And in fact, they indicted, that was the basis of one felony indictment under the Espionage Act that Mr. Drake was charged with. In all my years of experience, I have seen many equally egregious examples of the misapplication of classification as I did in this one particular email, but I have never seen a more deliberate example. Because this was not just somebody in the press of everyday business producing a document for their boss and slapping a classification statement on it. This was a document that for 3.5 years went through multiple reviews within the national security agencies, went through multiple reviews within the Department of Justice. Each and every time somebody made the determination, yes, 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 we're going to assign classification to this, it served as the basis for a felony indictment. It served as the basis to attempt to deny an American of his freedom for decades at a time, but yet it was, again, one of the most egregious examples of unsensitive information bearing classification markings that I've ever encountered. The whole thrust of the Brennan Center report is the need to restore, instill accountability in the system. I have filed a formal complaint with my former office inquiring as to whether or not the responsible officials at both the NSA and the DOJ have in fact or will in fact be subject to sanctions in accordance with the executive order, which says that doesn't matter whether it's an unauthorized disclosure or improper assignment of classification. They're both egregious examples of violations of the order and should be subject to similar sanctions. And I made it perfectly clear from my perspective, this is a classic case, although people routinely are held to account for unauthorized disclosures, be them government officials, military service members, defense contractors. I am not aware of anyone ever being held accountable for the overclassification of information. And from my perspective, this case is so egregious that if individuals are not held accountable in this particular case, then that provision might as well be taken out of the executive order because it will have proven itself entirely feckless. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Jennifer?
Thank you very much for inviting me to be a participant on this panel. And it is a panel that is discussing a subject about which people feel passionately, clearly, and rightly so. I agree with Bill that it's absolutely fundamental to our democracy to get this right. I also want to suggest, though, that there are a lot of tacks one can take towards this issue. My particular tack melds academia, kind of a not popular word in Washington political policy circles because it has the suggestion of theory and non-practical outcomes. But I want to suggest to you that there is actually something that academia can offer in this debate. And it has to do with the notion of perfecting intelligence, something that I've worked on very hard in my academic career after 10 years of working in intelligence for the U.S. government. And after spending many years, another 10 years yet again in academia, it's clear to me what the qualities of a superior intelligence service have been throughout history. And one of those qualities is a capacity for selective secrecy. I am absolutely committed to strengthening U.S. intelligence, but I am also absolutely convinced that to strengthen U.S. intelligence, we have to have the ability to not only create secrets, but release them. And this is crucially important as we move into the 21st century. We are saddled with a classification system and a declassification process that is more in sync with the Cold War and rigid bipolarity than it is the dynamic, multipolar world that is emerging. One driven by the information revolution and full of asymmetric threats that come and go rapidly. In this kind of an environment, the rigid procedures of the Cold War will no longer work. And our intelligence service is harmed by an inability to manage properly our secrets. This is not just about, valuable as public debate is, and and as important as it is to release information so the public can debate it, it's not just about that. It's also about, crucially, our national security capabilities. Just to give you an example, consider the bin Laden raid. How crucial was it that we kept all aspects of that raid secret until it was done? And then once it was done, how crucial was it that we released information in a timely way so that we could shape the information environment, shape how people understood our action took place, what we did, why we did it, and how we did it. The release of secrets in that instance was not well done. I don't know if you all noticed, but it was not terribly well done. We've got to fix that. And that means we have to move out of the blame game and figure out how to empower and enable our government servants who are working very hard to get this right and do it in a collaborative way. The Public Interest Declassification Board is trying to do that. It's trying to open up to the public, to get input from the public on how to truly transform the classification and declassification process. I have been very honored to participate with other members of the board, people like Marty Faga, who I know wanted very much to be here and participate on the panel. He was our acting chairman. He was the head of the National Security Agency, not the National Security Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office. As director of the National Reconnaissance Office, declassified the existence of that agency. He recognized the importance of some of the things Bill Leonard was talking about. When he came home, he likes to tell this story, when he came home and told his son, you know, this is what I've withheld for you for so many years. And it was like, but Dad, I knew this all along, you know? And you know, it was kind of a shattering experience for him. He was a member of this national security community. He also is now an advocate of transformation. All the members of the board are. Let me just read you some of these members. We have Bill Studeman, who served as director of the National Security Agency. He was also deputy DCI at one point. Herb Brooke led the CIA's declassification program. Sandy Unger served as director of Voice of America. Congressman David Skaggs served several times on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. William Burke served in the White House counsel's office. These are folks who straddle the worlds, the passionate worlds of perfecting intelligence, perfecting national security, and enhancing and increasing the public debate. So what have we done? Well, we advised on the revision of President Obama's Executive Order 13526, which has set up a National Declassification Center, and we've also engaged in really a quite unique process that I'd just like to note. We on the PIDB get credit for this process when, in fact, the whole thing is set up and done by the ISOO staff, some members of whom are sitting 3 rows back here. John Power, in particular, has led this show, and it's been a fabulous one. What am I talking about here? 18 months of holding public and private meetings with agencies, researchers, historians, public interest groups. We created a blog and drafted 7 preliminary white papers and asked for comments on those white papers. The blog entries were amazing. We got about 100 entries, and also the submission of transformative papers making recommendations on how we might think about transforming our classification and declassification system, including ideas submitted by the Brennan Center, which were very good and very helpful. I'll just go through a few of the things we talked about. We've talked about implementing a universal metadata standard for classified electronic records, regularizing the declassification review of classified congressional records, which will be a major step forward. Promoting discretionary declassification. We actually have, policymakers have the ability to decide to release secrets that no longer are need to be withheld, or that might provide an advantage, a decision advantage in diplomacy. We don't exercise that discretion enough. And I could mention some other ideas. One that's particularly attractive to me is the notion of redefining the classification of historical formally restricted data. This is an arcane subject, but we're talking about classified data that is forever out of the public domain, and it actually shouldn't be, because it's just historical location data, ancillary data associated with nuclear weapons, but not about nuclear weapon design or anything like it. It really should be treated as regular classified data and reviewed according to regular procedures for review of classified data. I know it's a bit arcane, but it was one of my hobby horses, and I cared a great deal about it. And I don't know. We can talk about it in the Q&A session if you're passionate about it too, but whatever. But the linchpin, from my perspective, of transformation will be technology. For goodness sakes, we're living through an information revolution. What does that mean? Well, we listen to a lot of folks in the private sector who talk about the amount of data that is swamping our classification process as a trivial problem. They say it's a trivial problem, the quantity. Thank you. Thank you very much. So how do we deal with the trivial problem? There are technologies out there called context accumulation technologies. And basically the idea is not to require dirty word searches, that is, looking for classified words inside documents, but rather looking at the whole context in which words exist in a document and making broad judgments that help human declassifiers figure out what really to pay attention to and what not to. It can cut down the time they spend in the declassification process by leaps and bounds. But the beauty of it is you can attach it to the front end of the system too. And one of the things I actually am concerned about is how much burden we put on policymakers in terms of filling out forms or doing things up front in the declassification process, or in the classification process, that takes away their precious time. If we have an automated, almost artificial intelligence capacity for vetting and reviewing documents as they are created, we can get more accurate classification up at the front end of the classification cycle, as well as use that technology for the declassification or back end. And putting that in place government-wide in the national security community could revolutionize how we do the classification and declassification process. It could be truly transformative. But we need to do pilot projects, and I was glad to see that the Brennan Center report does talk about doing pilot projects. I think this is an important way to move into the future expeditiously. And with that, I'll close up.
Thank you. Well, first, it's extremely gratifying to see so many of you here in the audience. I think it speaks to what an important issue this is and to the level of public awareness that things really have to change.
It has nothing to do with the fact you wanted a free lunch.
That's why we put it in the subject line, but never mind. I also want to thank Scott and my fellow panelists for being here and for everything that each of you has done to make sense of this very challenging issue. And I have a couple of people in the audience I want to recognize. I'm actually not sure if Congressman Cohen is here. All right, he was going to try to make it. It looks like he couldn't make it. But I do want to recognize my co-author on the report that the Brennan Center is releasing today, David Shapiro, who is in the audience. David got the ball rolling on this effort when I was on extended maternity leave last year, and the report is largely an effort of his, a reflection of his dedication and his insights. So I think we've heard a good deal about some of the problems of overclassification, the harm to national security, the harm to public debate. I'm going to take a slightly different tack and step into the unfamiliar role of optimist and talk about what can be done about this. So in order to start thinking about solutions to classification, to overclassification, it's important, it's necessary to understand the causes. And the preliminary cause, the primary cause that emerged in our research was the fundamental imbalance in the incentives underlying the system. That is to say, there is a grab bag of incentives unrelated to national security to classify, and no force that's exerting a meaningful push in the other direction. I'll mention some of these incentives, starting with the most banal reason for overclassification. Classifiers are busy. Jennifer mentioned this. They have other things to do. And the press of business discourages them from putting in the time and thought that is necessary, and I do think it is necessary, so we can talk about that later, to make good decisions about classification. And you know, this is something that's very common. If something looks vaguely national security related, it gets classified, and they move on. Next, classifiers are afraid. If they guess wrong and they release information that someone at the agency decides was sensitive, they could be in a lot of trouble. Not to mention the fear that a tragic incident could result that could in some way be traced back to them. And this is a major incentive to err, and to err quite dramatically on the side of classification. Another incentive, status. Documents that are classified get more attention than documents that are not classified. Employees who deal in official secrets perceive themselves or are perceived by others to be more important. And agencies can enhance their own status relative to other agencies by hoarding information. And then finally, there's the obvious incentive for officials who have been involved in some kind of misconduct or incompetence to hide the evidence, whether that's the gaffe of a single official or whether it's an entire government program that's operating illegally. Which of these incentives is the biggest driver of overclassification depends on who you ask. But you certainly don't have to assume widespread bad faith. You don't have to play the blame game, as Jennifer was saying, in order to deal with this problem. For what it's worth, my sense from talking to the people that I talk to is that all of these incentives and a few others combine to create an overall culture of classification that is self-reinforcing. I suspect that most people who classify too much are doing it simply because that's what everyone else does. But in any event, there's really not much that anyone can do about most of these incentives that I've mentioned. People with hard jobs will always be busy. Creating official secrets will always make officials feel important. Officials who make mistakes are always going to be tempted to cover up the evidence. So what that means is if you can't do anything to change the incentives on that side of the balance, you're going to have to come up with some pretty powerful incentives pushing in the other direction to balance things out. And right now, there's basically nothing on the other side of the balance. Let's start with the fact that classifying documents is easy. It's not quite a rubber stamp, but it's not too far off. And in particular, classifiers are not required to identify the national security harm that could result from release of information. Most notably, and I'll skip to the big ticket item here, as Bill was mentioning, no one is held accountable for classifying too much. The executive order that governs classification does allow agencies to impose sanctions for classifying documents improperly. But these sanctions are optional, and agencies have no interest in applying them. And even if they did want to apply them, there are no mechanisms in place to reliably identify employees who are overclassifying. So there's no accountability. So, as I've portrayed it, the incentives underlying the system are profoundly skewed. Given that fact, we set out in this report to design a proposal that would rebalance the incentives. And we developed 6 recommendations, but today I'm just going to talk about the 3 that comprise our accountability proposal. First, classifiers would have to explain their decisions. I'm not talking about an extended essay, but they should have to put forward 2 or 3 sentences explaining why the disclosure of the information would harm national security. Now, most classification today takes place through drop-down menus or other electronic means. So what we're proposing is simply to add specific drop-down prompts that would elicit this information. I've gotten a lot of pushback from government officials who say that this will create too much work, especially if they're sending, a dozen or more classified emails every day. And I know that it will create a burden. That's actually part of the point. In a democracy, blocking public access to information is a momentous thing. It shouldn't be easy. Think about it. All of the most consequential government actions in terms of their effects on the rights of the public, the more consequential they are, the more procedural protections get attached. And classification is a highly consequential action. But classifiers can be forgiven for losing sight of this when they can do it with just a few clicks of a mouse. There's also a practical element to creating this small hurdle. I don't think that it will be sufficient to dissuade people who are convinced that it will harm the national security if the document is released. I do think it might dissuade the many people who are classifying documents right now simply because they might as well. And I want to say just a quick word about using context accumulation technology on the front end, which Jennifer mentioned. I have tremendous respect for Jennifer and for her ideas, most of which I think are excellent. This is one question on which we differ. My sense is, first of all, that there ought to be an element of judgment that cannot be replicated by a computer, if only because, as Bill has argued very persuasively, classifiers should be thinking about the public interest in release as well as the need to classify. But even beyond that, this technology will be anything but perfect. And so at least in the beginning, there will be a number of things that are classified that shouldn't be, and things that are not classified that should be. The things that are not classified that should be will be caught by people who, it won't replace human effort, and people will see them and they'll classify them. The things that are erroneously classified, no one's going to go to the time and effort of declassifying them. So I'm concerned that context accumulation technology could create too much, but I maybe should have left that for the Q&A and we can discuss it more. Anyway, to move on, the main reason to require classifiers to provide explanations is to enable accountability, and that's the second part of our proposal. We've recommended that agencies conduct spot audits, selecting classifiers at random and reviewing a sample of their work. And this should be done by the offices of the Inspector General, because they are relatively independent anyway, and they're already set up to conduct this kind of investigative audit. They could use the classifier's explanation as their starting point, but if they needed more information in order to fully evaluate that explanation, they should have access to agency documents and personnel as needed. And then the third part of our proposal, which is really the key. The results of these audits should be tied to mandatory consequences. If a classifier were found to be performing very poorly on these audits, and there should be a fairly generous margin, I think, to accommodate mere differences in opinion, then that person would be subject to repeat audits every 6 months. And if the pattern continued, that would trigger a series of escalating consequences, starting with remedial training, moving on to a note in the person's personnel file, going on to temporary revocation of classification authority, and culminating in permanent revocation. So that's the heart of our proposal. I've spared you a lot of the gory details. As my husband is fond of saying about almost everything, it's not rocket science. And yet, despite its simplicity, nothing like it has really ever been tried. And I know that there are a lot of internal political reasons for that most agencies will push back very hard against that kind of oversight. But this administration has waded bravely into the fray, and I am hopeful that something like what we propose could be implemented as a pilot project if there were an agency out there that was willing to be a guinea pig. So I will end my remarks on that note of hope and optimism.
Congressman Shays.
Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to limit myself to 5 minutes. And I'm only doing that because one time I gave a talk and I saw my daughter walk out. And then when we were running, she said, "Dad, about that time you spoke too long, Dad." I said, "I know, sweetheart." She said, "No, Dad, you don't realize you spoke too long." I said, "Sweetheart, I know." She said, "Dad, it was terrible." So, anyway. What I'd like to say to all of you is that this is a huge issue. And I found myself thinking the tragedy is that government has punted down the road so many different issues, kicked the can down the road, so many issues, that an issue like this that members of Congress would love to kind of sink their teeth in, they're not going to. Because the press is going to focus on so many other issues, their constituents are, and yet this is huge. Less classification would mean better security. It would mean lower cost. It would mean a more informed government and a more informed people within that government. We had a hearing on, I co-chaired in the Government Oversight Committee a wonderful committee that oversaw Defense, State Department, USAID, Veterans Affairs, so we could kind of reach out beyond just a particular department. And we had a number of hearings on classification, overclassification. We ended the hearing with a question to the participants, and one of the participants was from DOD. I said, "How much do we overclassify?" And she said 50%. And then I asked the outside groups, "How much do you think we overclassify?" And they said 90%. So we're somewhere in between 50 and 90, because you can be assured that the DOD was underestimating what we overclassified. And I was stunned. Stunned is, you hear members of Congress say they're outraged and they're stunned, and it has no meaning. But I was really surprised. I was really surprised when I learned that for official use only was a make-up non-category having no legal binding. Everything I saw in government had for official use only, practically. And so I was almost thinking facetiously that we should just, whenever we print government paper, we'll just at the bottom put for official use only. So I've stamped this for official use only. And for official use only is there totally and completely to protect someone who may feel that if this gets out, they might get criticized, or it may look foolish. I mean, I had a difficult time having the CRS reports given to the public. Members of Congress asked for these reports. They're fabulous. They are fabulous. And we tried an experiment. There were 14 members of us at kind of my urging that we could put anything from CRS rather, the Congressional Research Service. And it could be made available to the public by going through our website. And that was, after a year, it was discontinued. But what a tragedy. The American people, if you tell them the truth, they'll have you do the right thing almost all the time. So let me just end by saying that I really believe if I were President of the United States, I would go to Congress, and it relates. I would go, and since I'm never running, I can say this without being looking like I am. I would go and I would say to Congress, your job is to do oversight. Your job is to find the good that we're doing and the bad we're doing and make sure it comes to light. Because I've come to the conclusion that by the 8th term of a president, they're clueless. Because they don't know what's happening underneath them. Roosevelt tried to get around that by simply calling, not the secretary, but calling someone way down and saying, what the hell's going on here? and learning from that person. So I'll end with that and just say I look forward to your questions.
So we have a microphone, so please raise your hand, and how about right there? Start us off.
I'm Bert Wides, and I've been concerned about working on excessive secrecy for half a century, and I just want to start by paying special tribute to Elizabeth and Bill for the incredible work that you've done, in addition to everyone else. I wanted to make a couple of very brief comments and then ask a question. First, with regard to, I can't let go by what Bill said about the Justice Department threatening to resign. It's easily forgotten that all those high officials only demanded a minor, significant, but minor change in the evading of FISA and constitutional requirements as a condition of not resigning. The second thing, with regard to the mechanical upfront screening, I have to tend to agree with Elizabeth for two reasons. One, I think the things that are most important for the public to know are going to be too complicated or arguably a question of security for mechanical sifting. And that relates to the second aspect. When you come to what is important for national security to keep secret, which a mechanical vetting would probably say classify, there's a problem in the discussion, inadequate discussion of the protean term national security. In the case of WikiLeaks, where all of the discussion is how the various items are harmful to national security, the question is it more in the U.S. security for the public to know that the government of both Bush and Obama spent 7 years threatening other countries to keep them from allowing President Aristide to return to Haiti? Or is it more in the national security for the public not to know that? But my question is this, and it really is different than all of the things you've suggested. I think that too much emphasis is placed on declassification down the road. Should it be in 20 years or 10 years, which is of interest largely to historians. And since the real problem of secrecy, you'd all agree, is for the Congress to get information while they're deliberating and for the public to have a functioning democracy. I would like to pose the question of how you feel about requiring that material, which clearly is classifiable, should nonetheless be accompanied, and I'm particularly thinking of national intelligence estimates as a good example, by a public version with whatever redactions are absolutely necessary. You'll recall that Bob Graham, although it was only a week or so before the vote in Congress, demanded for the first time an NIE on WMD in Iraq. And then they put out a public version of it, which was not too accurate, and the editor-in-chief's been apologizing ever since. But more recently, and I'm almost finished, more recently, General Petraeus and the White House, for half a year, was saying, leading up to the last decision on the troop withdrawals, that the Taliban's morale, troop strength, and public acceptance have been badly dented.
Okay, let's stop it there. Jennifer, do you have?
Can I just ask the question?
Well, I think you did.
Okay.
Jennifer, you want to take that one on? If
I will start,
an
and other people can
unclassified
chime in.
version of a classified document when it's put out?
Yes, and I'll respond to that, and also just briefly on the context accumulation issue, which is rapidly going to get me in deeper technological waters than I want to be. But I will gladly tread and flail in those waters in front of everybody just to tease that issue out a little bit. On NIEs, I'm a big skeptic on NIEs now. In my view, intelligence has a purpose, even in a democracy. Our very first president believed intensely in intelligence. It helped him win the Revolutionary War. Intelligence has an important purpose in keeping the nation safe, and I think we all recognize that. Intelligence, in turn, provides the decision advantages in what can be deadly competitions with terrorist organizations, like the kind that struck us in 9/11, and other states that mean us ill. So intelligence has value, and it only has value as long as the advantage it delivers stays an advantage. If you give it away, it's no longer an advantage. So the point is we need to classify what provides that advantage and discern the things that no longer give us an advantage and stop getting pinned down by those secrets that cost us too much, as Congressman Shays pointed out, that bleed us dry. You know, it's crazy. And in fact, any wily adversary would try to figure out a strategy to get us to generate more and more secrets and, like a Gulliver, get tied down by all our threads, our classified threads. The point in intelligence is to develop products that deliver advantage classified advantage to decision makers. And NIEs, in my view, have rapidly gotten to the point where they don't deliver that anymore. They've become something that is, to my mind, as a citizen in a democratic country, rather worrisome. When the government starts releasing reports as intelligence truth, and we receive it as of special weight, and it's published and released as the truth on an issue, it has the feel for me of a government press of sorts. It's not the way an intelligence service ought to function. NIEs no longer, I don't know how many of you have read NIEs and felt that you were profoundly and deeply informed by them, but most policymakers don't spend a lot of time with them. They aren't the premier documents that they used to be. This is in my view. Now, they're getting better, but I'm not in favor of doing public versions of these. What's the point? It's excessive expenditure of money. And I'll wait on the context accumulation because I've already taken too much time with that.
Okay. Maybe we could move on to another question, sir. Sorry.
Could I very, very quickly speak to your particular question about doing an unclassified version of classified materials? And just quickly to say, the executive order does require classifiers, where practicable, to do an unclassified addendum or to create an alternative product that can be disseminated either unclassified or at a lower classification level. The problem is, like the other requirements in the executive order, it doesn't get honored. It doesn't get followed. Therefore, we need audits to make sure that classifiers are creating these addendums and unclassified versions when it's practicable. And that is something that our proposal would speak to.
Sir?
This sounds a lot like the Moynihan report. I think Congressman Shays was there when Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan led a commission on secrecy, came up with generally the same evaluations with many of the same recommendations that sound like still having the fox guard the chicken house, because you still have the executive branch responsible for imposing the discipline that you've described, no matter how many standards that you erect. And it seems to me the flaw here is in Congress. You need a statute that says no monies of the United States can be expended to gather intelligence and gather information that's not shared with Congress. The congressional oversight function has dwindled to an ink blot, where you used to have Fulbright hearings, and not saying that everything needs to be in public, but you can have it in executive session. That's where Congress doesn't have the same incentives that the executive branch has to overclassify or withhold information. Excuse me?
To every member?
To every member, absolutely. Every member of Congress is representing their constituents. They've got to decide what's in the best interest of the United States. You can have a system where they have secrecy oaths that they can take. You can have them examined in some secured facility in the House building if you're worried about it leaking out to the public. There's no reason why that shouldn't happen.
I'm stunned by that because 535 members, somebody will tell somebody.
Maybe, but we have the former head of the CIA, George Tenet, testified of Mr. Shelby, the senator of the Senate Intelligence Committee, says the executive branch leaks like a sieve compared to Congress, and that was the head of the CIA. But anyway, it's up to Congress to impose sanctions, because you have the authority to impose rules and to even expel members for violating the rules. But the important element, it seems to me, is you need to have real congressional oversight. And it's not just the classification issue, because the executive branch regularly withholds information even that say they're not classified. I've been there testifying at hearings all the time, and a member will ask, is this document classified? No, but I'm still not going to tell you. It could be executive privilege, interagency communications, or something like that. But as long as you leave the executive branch in control of discipline, I think this is going to be just a presage for another report 10 years down the line.
Thank you. Congressman Shays, you want to address that further?
I do want to address it. I can think of a number of items that I didn't need to know, frankly. A number of issues I did not need to know, but somebody in Congress needed to know it. But to just have every congressman be exposed to every potential secret, to me, would be incredibly destructive. I believe in secrecy, and I believe that you can't tell people who don't have a right to know. I think the Intelligence Committee does. I think that you could have certain officials, you could expand the list a little bit. One of the problems is when you're told things that are intelligence, then you can't discuss them. And I'll give you a great example of I know one member who simply chooses not to be briefed because he doesn't want to have to abide by it. But I'll give you an example. During the war in Kuwait, we probably had 250 members as the Secretary of Defense walked in, as the Chief of Staff, which at the time, it was just a plethora of folks. And they kept emphasizing, they're going to tell us about 8 things, and we couldn't talk about any of those items. And then someone stood up in the back of the room and said, I want to be clear, I'm not allowed to talk about this. Yes, sir. This, I'm not allowed. And then he read every one of those items in the New York Times. He read it to us. He read it to us. But because we had been exposed to it in a classified briefing, we couldn't talk about it. And so some members simply choose not to participate.
That's simply
Very
wrong. If I
interesting.
can make up
Well, thanks. Could we move on to another question? I'm sorry.
Held the speaker debate clause privilege protects
Okay.
you from communicating anything you receive to any member or your
No.
staff.
Would you-
I just can't let the gentleman say that's simply not wrong. In Congress, our rules say if you are told, you cannot tell. That's what you sign. So you sign it, you pledge it, and you keep your goddamn word.
Sir, right there.
My name's Alan Sternstein. My question is going to be for Dr. Sims, but that position prompted just one observation, and that would be, it strikes me that the predicate for it is Congress's control over the purse strings and inevitably control over the executive branch. And I think that predicate raises some very profound questions about the relationship between the executive and Congress. So I'm not sure it carries you the distance it wants to go. For Dr. Sims, my question is more about clarification of your views regarding what happened after the Osama bin Laden mission, and that was with respect to the disclosure information. I would assume you're not saying that all information and details about that mission should be disclosed, although if that's what you're saying, then let me know. But if you're not saying that, I'd be interested in your trying to articulate what sorts of information should have been disclosed, what not disclosed, how, in fact, did the process work and fail, and how would you have improved that process?
Thank you.
That's an excellent question. I will begin the answer by saying I'm not privy to the inside story on the bin Laden raid, okay? So I know what you all know from the press. A vignette will help us understand. It was a disaster that we lost one of the helicopters and the tail was hanging over the wall of the compound. But after the fact, people noted, boy, that was a lucky break because it proves we actually did it. It proves that we were there and we got out and we used the procedures that we used. The point is, there was a considerable amount of concern after the raid about how adversaries might use deception to try to torque the story and make it sound different than it was. There was, to the best of my knowledge, no sophisticated planning for how to handle the information environment after the raid, how to convince people it really happened, how to convince people that, no, we didn't shoot women willy-nilly in the compound. No, we didn't maltreat him. We actually buried him by observing certain procedures. How do we convey what we want to convey about how we handled what would be a sensitive issue for the broader Muslim community, which we actually cared about? Understanding what our purpose was and why we were doing it. How would we relate the information and at what time to the Pakistanis? How would this all go down? That process of planning, ever since 2003, we've sort of gotten the wake-up call that we don't do planning terribly well, especially if it involves interagency planning that is of complex contingencies. This was a complex contingency in which intelligence was at its core. Intelligence folks have to figure out strategies for release of secrets, who's going to get to know, and what absolutely must be withheld. And they don't have the tools. What we're talking about here, it seems to me, I think in its most profound sense, is giving the people who guard the gates of our gated communities of intelligence more tools to manage the flow in and flow out of secrets. And it can't be, in my view, it really is not going to get anywhere if it's regarded as an adversarial process. We're only going to make progress if we understand that we need to have selective secrecy, including release, both for our democracy, but also crucially for our ability to protect the national security.
Thank you. Maybe somebody over here? Anybody? Yes, sir.
My name is Michael Binder. I'm an Air Force classifier declassifier. In listening to the panel, I couldn't tell if you were talking about the overclassification of information or the overclassification of documents. And those are two very different things. Are you talking about what original classification authorities do or derivative classifiers? And if you're conflating the two, I suggest that you separate them and treat them differently.
Can you explain why?
Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit?
Well, in the Air Force, there are a few hundred original classification authorities. Each one has responsibility for its own information, and people like Stephen Aftergood would like to have some of that information that is created new secrets, some of that information to be declassified. Derivative classifiers are essentially as many Air Force people as there are, numbering in the thousands, tens or hundreds of thousands, and they create documents which they classify themselves. And they are using classification guides that are created by the original classification authorities. So you have information that is created new, that is classified by an original classification authority. That information appears in documents which are classified by derivative classifiers, the people who write them. You can change the guides, you can declassify information, and then if that information appears in documents subsequently, it will not be or should not be classified. Historical documents classified based on old classification guides still have classification markings. You may say those are overclassified. Well, they're only overclassified because they haven't been reviewed by people like me who say there is no current classified information in here anymore. But the information that is still classified would make some of those documents properly classified. So I hope that, I haven't read the report, but we need to distinguish between those two different types of overclassification, information versus documents.
Liza, did you tackle this in your report?
I did. I wasn't sure how detailed to get in my opening remarks in terms of what people knew about original classifiers and derivative classifiers. Original classifiers are the ones who are the only ones who are authorized under the executive order to decide what information gets classified. Derivative classifiers are people who get a document that's already classified, and when they restate that information, they classify the new document that contains the same information. Or they use classification guides, which are prepared by original classifiers, which are supposed to direct them very specifically in terms of what they can classify and what they can't. So 2 points. First of all, if the system worked perfectly, then I would still, and derivative classifiers were simply, transferring markings. I would still think that original classification can include overclassification because people make mistakes. They classify documents that would not harm national security or information that would not harm national security if released. There might be some different issues in terms of what derivative classifiers were doing, except for the fact that a lot of these guides, not all of them, and I can't speak to the Air Force, but a lot of these guides, the criteria are so broad and so vague that the derivative classifier is, in effect, acting as an original classifier. And I'll just read you a quick example from the State Department guide, and this is supposed to make it absolutely crystal clear to the classifier whether to classify something or not. And these are the crystal clear criteria. In those cases where the U.S. has been or may again be involved as an intermediary, it is an additional concern that information not be released which would prejudice future negotiations on unresolved issues or impair the U.S.'s ability to continue an intermediary role to resolve those issues. For this reason, it is important that information be classified when its release might cause or revive conflict or controversy, inflame emotions, or otherwise prejudice U.S. interests.
That's just
I mean-
about everything.
So it's not quite. It's not quite. In theory, it's true, but in practice, not so much. That original and derivative classifiers are operating in different universes.
Bill, is there anything you want to add to that as someone who both worked in Defense Department and then had a kind of overview of the system?
Yeah, basically, I agree with Liza. It's a distinction without merit, quite frankly, because again, from an original classification point of view, the key word that is often overlooked in the executive order is the word may. It's discretionary, even for original classifiers. And it's not prescriptive. It doesn't say if it meets this, you must classify it. There's judgment that has to be applied. And my problem is even for the original classifiers, that judgment is never is not always applied. And from my perspective, there needs to be a balancing test even for original classification. And the balancing test should be what's going to create greater damage to national security, to disclose the information or to withhold it. Because the withholding of information can be equally deleterious. And that informed judgment, it's implied in the process, but it's not explicit, and I dare say people are on automatic overdrive. Well, of course, we always classify this. So, what's even to even think about, let alone talk about? But we have to build in that deliberate thought process in terms of, hey, what's the consequences, even from a damage point of view, if I withhold this information? That's not routinely done.
Thank you. Sir.
John Powers, NARA, ISU. Congratulations on your report. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Now I get to put you on the spot, though. And perhaps Bill, my former boss, too. And I'm really interested in the culture change that you talk about with re-incentivizing things. So with what agency would you start? And how would you go about doing it?
So, you know the answer to this. John has actually been extremely helpful to me as I've been working on this report. And one of the things that he and I have talked about is that it's going to be important to, since this is a pilot project, to find an agency that really comes into this with the right spirit, is interested in trying this, is interested in getting a handle on this program, isn't going to fight it kicking and screaming the whole way. There are statutory provisions regarding the role of the Inspector General in different agencies that actually allow some agencies to block investigations that involve national security issues. So those agencies are probably out unless they would agree not to invoke that right or authority. I think I'm not in a, I have been communicating with different agencies, officials at different agencies, to see if I can find an agency that might actually be interested in doing this. I wouldn't want to put any of them on the spot right now, since
Why not? It's the perfect opportunity.
I'm trying to think of an answer that doesn't make this look like pointless secrecy, but secrecy does have its purposes from times. I think small. I think it's going to need to be a small agency. I think it's going to need to be an agency that can give this, where this isn't an afterthought, an agency that really is considering this as an experiment that they want to try and that they actually want it to have the effect that it's supposed to have, rather than it's something they're doing because they're being made to do.
And you would foresee this in one agency, and for how long before?
So what we suggested in the report was 1 or 2 agencies, depending on how many guinea pigs you can find, and watch them for 2 or 3 years. You know, ideally, it would be a longer period so you could get more information about the trend in classification numbers over time. But I think I'm very optimistic that it will work, and I don't think. I wouldn't want to say, wait 5 or 6 years, because I think at some point before then we'll know enough to know that it's something that really ought to be tried more broadly.
Questions, sir? Oh. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to ignore you over there.
I'm not exactly an eye shot. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Emily Hickey, and I have to have a disclaimer. I'm a former employee of the Information Security Oversight Office, and Bill Leonard was my former boss. My question is not to him, but it's to, and I hope I don't mispronounce your name, Ms. Goitein?
Goitein.
Goitein?
Thank you.
Okay. I'm curious about, I agree with you about accountability, and classifiers should be able to justify and explain why they made the decision. I am concerned that you're choosing the Office of the Inspector General to be the audit, because I've never worked with the IG, but my belief is you're asking people to review classification decisions. They may not have the subject matter expertise. They may not understand all of the nuances and all of the historical background that went into play with that decision. My other concern is when you mention IG to a federal employee, you're automatically saying to them, you did something wrong, and we're here to make you pay. And I'm wondering what other alternatives would you consider?
Would you mind making a suggestion? Who would you put in charge of this?
Well, having come from ISU, the executive order does have an oversight function in there. It may not be strong enough. It may not have enough teeth. I think we should, we should look to trying to beef that up. Because I can see if you give this to the IG, I envision you're growing the government maybe by 40 to 100 people, where you already have a body in place that can do that. It may have to be tweaked, beefed up, but it would have to be a neutral body. And that may be difficult to find.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's very hard to find a neutral body to do this. I don't think there is any one perfect entity that can perform these reviews. We did consider other alternatives. We considered locating this a function in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, for example. Well, that was a suggestion that was made by someone I spoke to. So we thought about different options. Actually, one of the reasons why we decided to go with the Office of the Inspector General in the different agencies is because they're used to being hated, right? Yeah. Seriously. And so I think that they are set up to approach this kind of audit in an independent spirit. And I think there are very few other components of an agency that are in a position to do that. And some of the proof of this is that there is, there's supposed to be a self-inspection program that agencies are supposed to administer. And you know this, but for everybody else, there's supposed to be a self-inspection program. And a lot of agencies don't have one. They just don't do it. I mean, it's required, but they don't do it. Others do it, but they don't review the documents, which they are required to do as part of it. And what ISU has repeatedly found is that the reason it doesn't happen is because there is a lack of support for this endeavor from senior management.
Well, I used to do those inspections. First of all, there are not enough, at least when I was there are not enough ISU employees to do that.
I didn't mean the ISU employees. I meant the internal agency.
And even within the agencies, because the question gets to funding. The question goes to funding. And when an agency has to decide what it's going to fund, it's like the school system. First thing to go are the foreign language programs. So the self-inspection takes a hit. I also disagree, in a more collaborative environment, not where you roll over, you will get better results with your classification reviews, because I had that experience. And we would say, this shouldn't be classified, why is it? And the agency would go back and review. But it goes down to funding and resources.
Well, we should talk more. I mean, there were other reasons why. I mean, we thought about a lot of these things, and I can talk to you more about the reasons we selected the OIG to recommend. But obviously, this is just a proposal. So you and I should talk more. I'll give you my card.
This is probably going to be the last question we have time for. Perhaps right there. Okay. Well, let's make it two quick ones. Yeah.
Tony Schaefer, author of Operation Dark Heart, which some of you are familiar with. By the way, Scott, they've decided to allow Safe House in the next edition next week, so that's progress. I've testified before Congressman Shays, and I just got to ask you all, are you all naive to the way bureaucracy actually works? There's no upside to anything you're talking about regarding volunteers or enforcement. Until there is some level of legal basis for this from Congress, top-driven, there's no way this is going to be enforced. So I'm asking you, what is your realistic perspective on any of this ever coming into effect?
Well, if this hearing was overclassification, but the first people who spoke were talking about very sensitive information that they want available to more people. I don't come from that perspective. I'm coming from a whole different perspective, and I almost felt like I don't know if I should be here. I'm here about overclassification of documents, of needless junk. I think then if you isolate the more important stuff, then you'll be able to focus then on who should it be shared with. But right now, we have no hope of ever getting this done if the proponents of overclassification are talking about really sensitive stuff that they want more people to know about. If they do that, Congress is going to say, I'm not walking down that road.
And that to me is the ultimate challenge. I testified before Congressman Shays' committee numerous times, and I know I told him that classification authority is the unilateral constitutional authority of the president pursuant to Section 2 of the Constitution. I'm here to tell you I was wrong. I was wrong.
You were under oath.
I was wrong. It's amazing how smart you get once you leave the government. The fact of the matter is that this is a shared responsibility through all co-equal branches of government. There's only one thing the Constitution gives the president that he has unilateral authority, and that's the power to grant pardons. Everything else, his authority with respect to classification derives from his role as commander-in-chief and chief executive responsible for foreign relations. Everything that Congress plays a very real role in terms of declaring war, in terms of raising a military, in terms of funding the military, so forth, passing laws for the military. It's a very real role. And quite frankly, I had a conversation back in the summer of 2008 with Dana Priest. And we were talking about the election. And she was talking, well, if Obama gets in, things are going to change. And I said, no, they're not. Bullshit. They're absolutely not going to change. And the reason they're not going to change is because whoever won that election and wins the next election, they take an oath of office. And they swear to do two things in that oath of office. One is to uphold and defend the Constitution. The other is to faithfully discharge the office of the President of the United States, which means that there is no way in the world any person who assumes that office is going to leave it weaker than when they inherit it. And we've seen over this past decade not unprecedented, but significant assumptions of executive power that we hadn't seen in decades. And those assumptions of executive power took place without a peep out of the Congress, with all due respect, without peep out of our courts, with regular acquiescence of the American people as well. And so the bottom line is that in terms of the culture being changed, the only way the culture is going to be changed is when the three co-equal branches of government stand up to this issue and recognize that they all have a very important role to play, and to recognize that this system, in fact, serves to improve American safety and security, and serves the American national interest, and doesn't, in practice, actually end up undermining it.
Okay, I think we're pretty much done, but there's a man who's been patiently waiting, so let's squeeze in one more.
I've been waiting to ask this question, and Congressman Shays just touched on it, and that's that you have a problem of overclassification, and then there's the related but separate problem of the sharing of classified information with the people in the government who need to have it in order to discharge their job.
Two separate issues.
We saw this in warrantless wiretapping, where I think through a misinterpretation of the Gang of Eight provision, information was shared with a very small number of members of Congress when even the full intelligence committees weren't told what was going on. A variety of situations in connection with the torture program, the same thing. And I guess my question is it a completely separate problem, or will the implementation of a spirit of declassification have some effect on the stovepiping of information, the protection of information from people who need to have it?
I think it will have an effect, more of an indirect effect, but I do think if you go back and you look through all this congressional testimony at every hearing, some chief of police would come forward and say overclassification, not just clearance issues, but overclassification inhibits my ability to get the information I need on a timely basis, which makes sense because given the nature of this particular terrorist threat, where you don't know what the targets are, you don't know who's going to need to know the information ahead of time, whether it's going to be a private entity, if the target is a private structure. There will always be situations where you need to get the information to the person and before you have time to identify and clear the relevant people. So that being the case, overclassification, which I would agree with you, and I hope that you don't feel that you're not in good company on this point on this panel, that there is information that is extremely sensitive that should not be released. I absolutely agree with that. And one of the main problems with overclassification, which we discussed in the report, is that information becomes, the protections for that information become weaker when you pile all this other junk on top of it.
You know, I truly believe, I had 20 hearings about the terrorist threat before September 11th. I truly believe if we didn't overclassify documents, there was basic information that should never have been classified, that if other agencies were aware of it, we would never have had September 11 happen. That's what I believe. So that's why I feel like if we can make headway just there, it will be, all of you will be happy. And then, but you maybe not happy enough. But then if you isolate the remaining amount, then you could have an intelligent conversation of how could more people know it? How could more people know it? And I think that's very justifiable. Clearly, I don't want 535, but I didn't want just the top echelon of the Intelligence Committee knowing something very important, and then one or two members denying who saw it that they never saw it. That was an absurdity.
Well, on that point, I guess we're pretty much out of time, so thanks very much. Great questions, and maybe one last round of applause for the panelists.